Emil Cadlick here with FantasyNation.com. We have a wonderful pioneer of fantasy sports today. Started his career in fantasy sports in 2000, and in 2001 he created his own website. And over the years he's been very influential, including being a part of the Fantasy Sports Writers Association. He started there in 2004, very young into the organization, ended up becoming the president and did a fantastic job of helping writers in the fantasy sports business. It was a very important thing, and I'm very honored to introduce Mike Beacom. How you doing?
Doing well. Good to be with you, Emil.
Yes, this is going to be fun. I'm excited to find out more stuff about that I either forgot or didn't know. So when you were young, how did you like football, or what sports were you into?
Yeah, like a lot of kids, I played everything. Grew up, every weekend after school, that's what you did. And so, yeah, football was always my favorite sport. But basketball, baseball, little league in the summer. I bowled. I did karate. I did anything you could do. I was interested in.
Yeah, I guess winter sports in that area were probably more popular than maybe southern states. So.
Yeah, I mean, with the good thing about football though is you can in Wisconsin you do play that year round, and so if we had to play on streets covered with ice, we did. So I mean, it was more fun in the winter months to play football in Wisconsin.
Wow. So when did you learn about fantasy football?
There were books that came out in the 80s that you'd see in your school libraries, like Cliff Carpentier. Does that sound right? Kind of like little reference books. And so a friend of mine, CJ, had talked about was start a fantasy league, and our first fantasy league was 1991. And so I was in high school, and it's just a 4-person league. We did not have yardage. We played. Actually, we did. If you had over 100 yards rushing, receiving, or 300 passing, that was equal to another touchdown for that game. But I picked 4th and 5th in that draft. I took Jerry Rice and Andre Reed, and in the second round I came back and I took Emmitt Smith, who was in his second year in 91. And that league went on for 20 plus years. It was a keeper league. I kept Emmitt every year up through his last 2 years with the Cardinals. So he's the only person that continuously was rostered by the same person, but that's a little bit more to do with me. But yeah, so it was my start was then, and really took to it.
How could you have a Dallas Cowboy on your roster in Green Bay territory?
Yeah, I loved. I mean, like anybody else, I love the Packers, but my dad was a Cowboys fan from the 70s. So the kind of the peak of the Cowboys through the Landry years. And so in our household, you grew up, we watched the Packers at noon and we watched the Cowboys at 3. And in those days, CBS carried the Cowboys were often the 3 o'clock game. They were often the afternoon game. So you saw them a lot.
Yeah.
So yeah, I was James Lofton and Lynn Dickey and the Packers were not great in the 80s. The Cowboys early in the 80s with Dorsett, I was a big Tony Hill guy. That was the Danny White era. They were good, but that was beyond, their peak. And then towards the end of the 80s, it was miserable all the way around between those two teams.
So speaking of the Dallas Cowboys, one of my favorite questions is, who was the original 22 of the Dallas Cowboys?
Is that before Hayes?
That was Hayes.
Bob Hayes in the 60s. Yep. And so
there may have been somebody before, but famous-wise, he was the first that I'm aware of. I probably should do more study on that. So you mentioned you drafted 4th and 5th in the first round of your league in 1991. Tell me about how they structured that. That's weird.
So, I mean, it was 4 of us. The only people that really wanted to play, 4 guys. And so I had, back-to-back picks in a snake draft.
Oh, okay. 4, okay.
And so, yeah, I mean, it's fantasy then was more fun in some respects because it was just 4 guys that were really sports geeks. Nobody else got it in our school. They didn't understand what we were doing. And everything was pad and paper, and everything was waiting for the newspaper to come out. That 91 season, that was the year that the Redskins were really good, and Mark Rippon, Chip Lohmiller scored a lot of points as a kicker. And so I can remember losing a game because Chip Lohmiller went crazy on a Monday night and came back and beat me, and so that kind of stuff where you may not even, be able to stay up and watch the game, but you're checking the box scores the next day. It was not real time. It was very much, stuff you talk about all day in school, how you got robbed the night before. It was fun. It was a lot of fun.
Was this league a spinoff, or you just thought of this idea and started it?
I think CJ had a basic structure he must have learned on how to play, and so he had kind of explained it all to us. We all knew, we followed football, baseball, NBA, college sports religiously. And it's one of those things where you kind of say, how come nobody's done this before? And it wasn't that, obviously it had been done for years. But, you discover it and you think, wow, it's fun. It adds an element to it. And then pretty soon we're doing a baseball league later into that school year. And now there's 12 guys because other people want in on it. And so it grows from there, kind of word of mouth in those days.
Oh, baseball right after that. So you went to college. What did you study in college?
Yeah, I went to the University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point. Wanted to be a sports writer. My interest, I was not going to play collegiately, let alone professionally, but that was my passion all growing up, and I enjoyed writing. I went to that college because my older brother Chris had gone there. It was far enough away from home, but I liked the campus. And so went there for sports journalism, got a degree in communications and another degree in political science, but had a chance there to write all 5 years and cover sports on campus.
Wow, that's fantastic. So when did you get an idea about getting into the business of fantasy sports?
I did a lot of things that were entrepreneurial in college, newsletters for the school district in that community. I was the editor of the state amateur wrestling monthly publication. So when I got out of college, I knew at that point I wanted to be a freelance writer. And I actually took a tour of Krause Publications, which was about 20 minutes away from the college I went to. And they had, I grew up, I'm a sports memorabilia collector, not so much anymore, but growing up they had, I think they did Baseball Cards magazine. Later they did Tough Stuff was a magazine. And so I knew Krause from that, and they had Fantasy Sports magazine at that time. And so I toured their facility, didn't apply for a job out there, but eventually that's what I wanted to do was as a freelance writer. So I took a job at a weekly paper and just kind of to buy some time when you're coming out of college, you're still transitioning. And within that first year, I sent a note to Greg Ambrosius, who was the editor of Fantasy Sports magazine, with a pitch on some research I'd been doing on historical rookies and, why they're overvalued in most drafts. And Greg took a chance. I think it was in their second. They had 2 football publications annually at that time, and he put it in their second magazine. And then after that, I started calling people that had online sites to try to write for them that season. And the first person I called was John Hansen. And John's an industry leader, but I think he said, who? Never heard of you.
Sounds like it.
And then I called Lenny Papano, at Draft Sharks, and this would have been the fall of 2000 or that summer. And Lenny gave me $50 a week for covering 2 games and then doing a feature. And that $50 a week was like the best money I ever made in my life. And so for that season in 2000, that was it. At the end of that, Lenny was looking at doing a baseball site because he had Draft Sharks and he was looking to go into baseball. And we talked about it a little bit. I really wasn't a baseball guy at that point. I loved the idea of doing fantasy full time, but he found somebody that was a better fit for him. And it wasn't, but that's what got me thinking, maybe I should try to do my own thing. And so in 2000 and I guess that was 2000 and 2001. And in 2002, we started our own site and launched it and took off from there.
Yes. Could you see the screen?
Oh man. Yeah, that's that brings back some memories.
September 2002 is that particular
Yeah.
frame.
Yeah. No, my longtime close friend, Brian Van Stippen, who is, we're still business partners together and we're still close. We just took the information I had from the work I had done and some ideas and put together this site. I think we came up with $7,000 between us, and that was enough. And we advertised in your publication. We were in Forecast and we were in Index that first year.
Wow.
And found somebody to help us build a site. Our biggest angle, as crazy as it sounds, is nobody was really covering college fantasy football. And I don't know that it's still not really, but the idea is we wanted to crack into that market. Pete Schenke would probably tell you that they did it first because he had Pete Futek from College Football News would do a one-page ranking in RotoWire's magazine, but they didn't really cover college fantasy. They weren't doing player news at that point. We saw that as an opportunity, as a niche, and we did probably have a third of our subscribers were for college, but it was still a pretty small number, and it would just that wasn't the launching point.
Wow, that's fantastic. So Van Stippen was part of that from the beginning, or?
Yeah, it was really the two of us that ended up putting some money together and doing it. We did fantasy GMs for 3 years. We worked with a handicapper and basically helped cross over with their audience. If they had some wagering people that were interested in fantasy, we were providing that information. But we did that for 3 years, and then after that, we merged with Pro Fantasy Sports and Tony Finn and merged in with him, and that really grew what we were doing and did that for another 3 years.
Yeah, and I remember you said you covered 8 sports there at Pro Fantasy Sports.
Yeah, and we covered, and not at the scope of RotoWorld, RotoWire, KFFL in terms of volume of player updates, but we did player updates for golf. For Brian, big thing was he wrote for a number of racing sites, fantasy racing sites. And so he had extensive content for fantasy racing, and then pro and college football, pro and college basketball, and baseball. And I'm probably missing one, but we had about 35, 40 guys writing for us.
That's
and this
incredible.
might have been, maybe this was maybe before us. But when the site got relaunched, there was a ton of information, and really took what we were doing to the next level.
Yeah, I guess this was 2001, November of 2001 on this particular snapshot that I took from the Wayback Machine. Fantastic. So you guys sold that business.
And we sold to Jeff Thomas, who's a crazy thing about fantasy I found was that there's so many people based in Wisconsin.
Yeah, it is crazy.
JT was in Kenosha, which is southeast Wisconsin. Mike Hall and Pete Schenke, and those guys are more south central part of the state. I mentioned Greg Ambrosius. He's up by me. And I know that there are others, but there seemed like Wisconsin, for whatever reason, was a hotbed of fantasy through those formative first decade, 2 decades of the industry.
Yeah, that is interesting that that's the case. And I remember early days of magazines in 1990 to 1994 or so, that Appleton was a mega place to sell magazines. It was huge. The sell-through was incredible, which I assume is, in that general area.
Well, it's a great football base. I mean, Appleton, Green Bay, kind of that valley. People are fanatical about football, and so it was just fun because we're all small community people. But I'd go to FSTA events, and I'd see a half dozen guys from my home state. What else do you do in Wisconsin? So
maybe not correlated perfectly, but it looks like you also wrote for SI.com.
Yeah, coming through that, trying to think, probably James Quinton first started writing when James was at SI. Fantastic guy, editor. Did a fair amount of work for him. He was part of that. I think at one point ESPN hired about 8 guys that were the lead guys at all these other sites. And that's when part of the Matt Berry rush. James was part of that. And so stayed through that working with their team. I did a lot of other things that were, mainstream NFL coverage. I covered the Big Ten for many years. And so I did some stuff for SI that was non-fantasy. But that was the time where they were launching their annual magazine. So I did a fair amount of featured content and some capsules for SI's magazine during that period.
Okay. And obviously, you worked with our magazines for many years and also writing for footballdiehards.com.
Longer than anything else I've done, Emil. So I don't remember the first year. I think some of the early stuff I did for you was college fantasy football. That was probably the niche I pitched was, can I do something more than what Pete was doing in the RotoWire magazine? We gave that a shot for a little bit. But yes, I want to say I've probably contributed to your magazines for, this might be my 20th year.
Wow.
So I'm certainly appreciative of that.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Also, you were an editor for a whole bunch of stuff, including Lindsay Sports Annuals.
So Lindy's, I think has been around for about 40 years. I still do a feature story every year for their NFL annual, but I edited their Big Ten publication for a period of time. And so Lindy's a great guy. He's got a loyal audience as well, and it's been good to work with him and Howard Balzer at that group.
Oh, yes. The Inside Wisconsin Sports Magazine, you worked for them also?
Yeah, so great publication. Lasted probably 5 or 6 years. It was a high-end, kind of like a Sports Illustrated magazine that covered all levels of Wisconsin sports. And so the idea was, top high school standouts, to have a 4 or 5 page feature piece. At the same time, we were doing photo shoots with the Packers, with the Badgers. It was a high-end, it was a high-cost publication, but one of the best experiences I ever had, because I had a chance to manage a pretty decent-sized photography team, editorial team. I had department writers, and it was a sandbox every month, putting out those issues for as long as we did, until eventually, I think it was just that the magazine was very expensive to produce, and the publishing house had to make a decision about whether or not they wanted to focus on other publications in their group.
Yeah. And also, you worked with Pro Football Weekly?
Yeah, for a long time. Kind of the niche, up until when Hub sold it, I did a lot of their historical stuff. So I was not a full-time staffer like Eric Edholm or some of those guys. They had a fantastic team. I worked for Keith Schleiden, was the editor, and Mike Holbrook was the managing editor. But a lot of times, it felt like I was the morgue guy. Somebody would die, and I'm a big football history nut. And so I would do a piece kind of celebrating them within 48 hours, 24, 48 hours, turning that around. But I did quite a bit for the publication, the print publication and online. I did a regular season, a series called Forgotten, where I'd find somebody like Milt Plum, who was the quarterback of the Browns, easy to forget, but he had some good passing numbers. And then, other things, like I used to do something called Hall of Fame Meter, where I would take 100 guys that had at least 5 years in the league, and I would give them somewhat of a rating on likelihood to be in the Hall of Fame. And that would stir things up, because if you said Tony Romo had anything better than a 10% chance, people would eat him for lunch. So it was fun. Pro Football Weekly really was creative, a good group of people over there, and enjoyed that experience.
Yeah, the people love lists, and they love arguing about lists.
Yeah, that's the fun stuff.
What about the Football Digest? You worked there also?
Yeah, I remember that when I was a kid. It was weird. You'd see little index size publications. They did baseball. I used to buy their baseball. They did football and basketball. One of the first things I wrote for as a freelance writer is their football publications. I did a piece on Tennessee's defense. That was like the Kevin Carter years. I did something on 40, the importance of the 40-yard dash time. So I interviewed like Anquan Bolden and Steve Largent and Ron Wolf, and
Wow.
how talent evaluators use that as a tool, and what, receivers think as far as, is it overstated? So like anything else, feature stories are all about pitching ideas and having the right people for sources. And that was one of my first opportunities as a writer.
Wow, that is pretty neat. Also, you worked with Cox Media Group?
Most recently.
That's
Cox.
okay.
Yeah, Cox has really a legacy. They have a large media operation, a lot of radio stations. I think they have the Tampa Tribune and a half dozen large market newspapers. It's one of the largest, I believe it's one of the largest privately held companies in the country, based in Atlanta. And they had looked at launching a series of verticals to transition to more digital. They started with SEC Country and Land of 10, which were huge college bases. And they went out and bought some of the best writers, beat writers from the SEC and from the Big Ten. And with that, they brought in some of their audiences to follow them over to that group. They had interviewed me, I think, to be the editor of Land of 10. I was more interested in their NFL launch. So I oversaw the content and development for a couple of years. Large budget, had a chance to work with people like Bill Williamson, ESPN guy, who was a fantastic guy. Howard Balzer came and did some copy for us, who's a legendary NFL writer, and really had a good group of people on our editorial team. Unfortunately, the SEC Country was, I think, the largest reach for any college coverage. And at a time, they had some change in leadership, and they slowly shut all those verticals down.
Wow.
I think that was a mistake, because I really feel like they had built a strong offering, especially on the college side.
Wow, interesting. Tell us about your work with football.com.
It's an interesting story. Good friends of mine, Rob Freeman, but John Maroney, who's based, he lived in Racine. Rob and his partner started a website for land auction, and then eventually they transitioned to auction.com. And so auction.com hit at the right time when the housing bubble burst in about 2008, 2009. They took up all this inventory from large banks, Bank of America, other things. And nobody thought you could sell houses online. And they did very well with that model. And they sold it recently. But in the mid-90s, Rob bought football.com. He bought basketball.com. He bought trivia.com. And they had always kind of been underdeveloped sites. He had all these other business interests that were lucrative that demanded most of his time. He just didn't have the time to really develop those URLs. And so knowing John was somebody that helped us build a beta site for pro fantasy sports. John brought me over on a couple of occasions to just kind of help them launch some different ideas. Never really took off. I think in some ways football.com is almost too big of a name. What do you do with it? But that was another sandbox, a lot of opportunity to play with some things and see what sticks.
Yeah, that's pretty neat. Wanted to go back to the Writers Association. It was a very important association for fantasy writers. Let's start at the beginning and tell us how you got involved and what your roles were.
So I taught journalism for 16 years on campus. I love working with young writers. I used to judge the writing contest for the Wisconsin Newspaper Association. I like that. And one of the things that I like about fantasy, people like Matt Berry, anybody will tell you this, is it is an industry where people feel like they can give back, because all of us really at some point were nobodies. It's not like NFL broadcasting where you're Tony Gonzalez one day, you're an elite tight end, and then you're on TV, or Tony Romo, and now you're the highest paid broadcaster. Most of us were just guys who were sports fans and found our way through fantasy. So there's an opportunity to give back. doing some of the things I was doing, I was looking for those opportunities in fantasy, and I was just searching fantasy sports. I might have searched Fantasy Sports Writers Association or something like that. And I found a website, and I was surprised in the Google search to even see something. So I click on the link, fswa.org. And I think after spending a little bit of time, I could tell that it had just launched within the last 30, 60 days. It was new.
Wow.
There wasn't much on there. There was a board of directors. You were the vice president. Ryan Houston, who was the president. And then Bob Harris and Kirk Boyelis were the other two on the executive committee. And the chairman was vacant. And it was almost like, wow, this is perfect. I'm looking for an opportunity to do something. I like working with young writers. And this is, I'd been in fantasy at that time, knew you at that time. And so I might have reached out to you and you said, talk to Ryan. I reached out to Ryan, same thing as John Hansen. Ryan Houston's first response was, Mike Beacom, never heard of you. And if you know Ryan, that's what you would expect. I mean, it was kind of like, never heard of you. And so I said, well, I'm really interested. I work with these contests. I'm looking for an opportunity. And so Ryan asked me to provide a resume and some other information for this kind of unpaid, volunteer charitable or, position. And I sent it to him and he got back to me. He said, well, I talked to Emil and he said, you're an okay guy. So we'll try it out for a little bit and see if it works. So that's how I got involved with the Writers Association. But I really enjoyed that opportunity, and it really led to a lot of good times over the next decade.
Yes. Now, you started out as the chairman, and we were evolving. What was going on. Of course, you eventually was the president and had an incredible, successful career at helping. Tell us some of the things like the Hall of Fame or the writing awards that you helped develop.
I fortunately I got the chance to be on the ground floor. I always say, I wasn't a founding member, but it was close to that. So we hadn't talked about a lot of those things. The writing awards came first. That was the first real big thing we did. And what I know was there was this emphasis on we're going to get it right. We want to make sure that we have a process where we reward the best of the best in these categories. So obviously we had to figure out what those categories were. I think we came up with like Football Writer of the Year, Series, Best Article. There was difference between major media at that time and smaller companies. And so we had figured that out. Back then, people would email their documents, and there was half of us that would go through and kind of black line anything that was revealing from the site they wrote on, what their name was. So we would clean the documents. And then there was a group that read through them. So you're talking, even in that first year, hundreds of articles. And it was a lot of work. And then we would come on a call and we would compare our voting totals and come up with a number. And if there were ties, we'd figure out a way to break a tie. That was rare. I remember on one of those early calls, it may have been talented Mr. Roto. I'm not sure, but we had one company winning a lot of awards. And somebody on the call said, this is not going to look good if one company wins too many awards. We should spread this out. And the great thing is there were a number of us that were like, no, we're not doing that. That's the point of this. Is it doesn't matter if one company wins a bunch of awards. What matters is we recognize the best. It's not political. We're not trying to look good, or we're not trying to reward the right people. We're trying to recognize the best work. And however that comes out in a blind process, that's the integrity of the process. So that really gave me this assurance that, hey, this is going to be a good thing. We're going to do it right.
Yeah, it was a very great process that you guys created. And then when did we get the professors involved in as far as the editing of the reviewing of the products?
It was right when I took over as president, or maybe that year before. The first year, I went out and searched for some people. Actually, one of the people we had was Leonard Shapiro, who was a longtime Washington Post writer. He was a adjunct professor at the University of Madison. So I had a little bit of an in there. And I just called him and said, hey, we're doing this. We want to take it out of our hands. Because even though we were doing a blind process, there was still, well, okay, your board is reading them. So I think the idea is we wanted to create a whole nother level where we would have people that had credibility, but no industry ties whatsoever. So that was one more level of perfecting the process, if you will. So Leonard Shapiro was one. I forget who else was all included in that. And then after that, we just kind of looked for people that had specialties in sports and really a high pain tolerance in the month of December, because it requires so much work. And so Mead Loop from Ithaca has been there for a long time. Steve Hill, who was a colleague of mine, taught a sports journalism course. He did it for many years. I'm sure there are others that I'm missing, and I regret to miss. But, I don't know if we really maybe get them a gift card or used to send them some sort of, there's no budget for this, but something of appreciation. But these guys spend a lot of work. And really what people don't know too is that you spend a ton of work when we went to a digital format to really get the database ready for them to do. That's probably the most laborious part of it. But these guys that have no interest in or they have no stake in the industry whatsoever to take that time and go through that process every year. So we've got legitimate awards. That's something that's probably not been promoted enough.
Yeah, I think that I really am proud of you for doing that process, adding the professors and getting it outside of our hands. I think that was a real professional way of and these professors that know how to, that are in the writing business, all these people in the writing, so they're perfect for reviewing this, and they're independent from the board and the members or the president and vice president, etc. So I think it was a great move, and it's been going on for a long time now. And we get, like you said, we get like a 900 to 1,000, 900 to whatever that is, 1,000 articles a year, which is a lot of articles to go through.
It's incredible, but it speaks to the interest. I mean, the writers, we've all been at that point. I mentioned, starting out with draft, you're not making enough to raise a family. You're not making enough to even, help your beer fund. But the idea that you might be recognized for an award, that has value. They're excited about that. And so I always felt really great about that opportunity. Everybody pitched in and everybody spent a lot of time doing it. But we had something to sell. I mean, and I'll say this, I've learned through that process, it doesn't matter how many steps you take. It doesn't matter how honest you are. There's still going to be people that aren't happy because they see the work they put in and they feel like, how could it not be me? And I had a number of phone calls to try to win people over. And the thing was, as long as I had the confidence that, hey, we're taking all these steps to do it right, then I had the confidence to get on the phone with somebody and say, I know you guys are unhappy that maybe you didn't win an award, but let me tell you how we're doing it and why I think it's legitimate and why you should continue to participate and to support it, because we're doing everything we can to make it an honest process.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Tell us about the development of the Hall of Fame awards and the process there.
So the Hall of Fame was close behind the writing awards originally for the FSWA, but it failed, and then it got shelved. And the reason is there were so many strong personalities with the board and the executive committee and how we should do the Hall of Fame that we just never could agree on a process for that to match the writers awards. And so we put it away for a number of years. And it's probably a good thing we did. We were able to focus on other areas. The FSTA really did the same thing. They had an early Hall of Fame, and then I believe they stopped doing it for a period of time and kind of revisited theirs after we had brought ours out. Right around probably 2010, 2011. My memory is not great. Maybe it was 9. I don't know. We started having that conversation because I realized that we had the time and we were to a point in the industry where people had been in the industry for 20 years. And so naturally you want to you want to recognize legacy. Writing awards recognizes the past year. The Hall of Fame recognizes your legacy. So one of the first things we did is, how do we define it? That's what we couldn't do the first time around. And the definition was, A, you had to have a strong body of work, but also B, you had to be innovative and or influence others. I'll use you as an example. You've written a lot of articles, and in the industry, you've been innovative, but in the editorial part of the industry, probably, in my opinion, your greatest contribution is the number of writers who have written for your 4 publications and diehards. And so to me, that's like, that's recognizing a great contribution just beyond somebody that's a recognizable face. Because we know we have people, ESPN's a good example, that are producers and they're editors. They're some of the strongest people in the industry, but they're not the personalities. They're not the face. So the Hall of Fame had to find a way to recognize that, not just the celebrity, not just the star. So defining it was first, and then building the selection process was second, and that took some work. That was definitely involved.
My recollection, I was the vice president. I really actually never got directly involved. I'm still the dang vice president of the Writers Association. I never really got directly involved in the Hall of Fame process, but what I recall from it, and I'll say a few things, you can correct me, is we had like a 2-phase process, and we created a sub-board, and you couldn't be, if somebody was being reviewed for Hall of Fame, if you knew that person or worked for that person, you had to step away from that board temporarily, and we had to get people that weren't directly involved. And does that sound about right, or what else was there?
Yeah, our executive committee identified a master list of people we thought were eligible. So based on the criteria of how many years you were in the industry, I think it was like 10 years total, body of work. Once you were deemed eligible, then that went into, that list went to a selection group that basically I picked, and it was all people who were not eligible for that reason. Mike Clay was one of the first people I talked to, because Mike was, Mike's a guy that I knew would spend time. And so we had 4 or 5 guys that were on that selection committee, and same as the writing awards, they would go through and grade it with the criteria, and then we would put the numbers together and see how the combined scores worked out. And so as you can imagine, inaugural class matters. I knew going into that there were going to be some hard feelings, because you can only have so many. We were giving awards at the Fantasy Sports Trade Association for many years, and Greg Ambrosius, I think, was the first to allow us to do that. Jeff Thomas was president. He allowed us to do that. And then up through Paul Charchian. And to be fair to them, they would say, yeah, we want to support you. You got 30 minutes. Well, when you only have so much time, you can't have 15 acceptance speeches, and people want to fly out there and spend some time. So that was a limiting factor too. But that inaugural class was going to be a challenge. And I do think it worked out though.
Yeah, it was a great process. I remember at the beginning of all this, there was people in the industry kind of resisting the Writers Association for whatever reason. We don't have to get into that, but I remember even reaching, we as the board were trying to say, hey, this guy, we should consider this guy. So we'd reach out to that guy saying, we'd like to get to nominate you or to review you. We need a bio and a letter of recommendation. And they're like, they would be negative about it and whatnot. But we were trying to really do our job right. So we didn't wait for people to beg to be considered. We reached out. And I remember a couple of those. One you mentioned earlier, who was, he didn't like the awards of anything, and he was kind of negative about that kind of stuff. And he had a very good foundation of work, and he would refuse to put his stuff in. So I wrote his bio. I went on the internet, and I knew the guy, and I found all sorts. I put together his bio, and I put together his letter of recommendation without him even knowing. And of course, he went through the process, and he was put into the Hall of Fame, and he had an acceptance speech, and he never knew. He still doesn't know today that you know, we did the groundwork for them because that's what we were doing in the Writers Association. We were trying to support the writers, even though necessarily they were a little annoyed at whomever. Of course, now they're very happy about it. And there was one other person that wouldn't put all his information in, and I wrote his reference material, or his the second one. I'm forgetting it now. Anyway, and he never knew either, and he obviously won, and they won on their own merits. But we proactively tried to make sure that the people who we felt should be considered were considered with the process, which is kind of funny.
Yeah, no question. I won't mention names either, but the first one you mentioned, nobody would question him being in the Hall of Fame. He's certainly somebody that stacks up and is worthy. And his acceptance speech, and I think it was the last year before I stepped down, very gracious, great speech. And some of it too, there are people that are humble, and so you're dealing with those things when you're talking to people. And there's really strong opinions. Same as I had to make phone calls for the Writers Awards. I mentioned Ron Chandler. Ron's a baseball guy. He's one of, if not the most respected baseball people in fantasy, and he's been in the business for a long time. When we had the inaugural class, and I think the second class, Ron was not happy because there are some early pioneers for fantasy baseball that he felt were really being ignored. And at that point, he was, wanted to walk from it. And I had some long conversations with Ron, really just saying, look, we want to get this right. And so, let's make sure that they have a strong bio. Let's make sure that the voters are aware of their contributions. And then they stand on their own. It doesn't mean because somebody feels strongly that person then gets in. It just means if you've got information we don't, let's get that out there. To Ron's credit, he participated. I think that the 4 people he really felt strongly about, I'm pretty sure 3, if not 4 of them eventually got recognized. And that is part of what you're talking about is if you know something we do, if they were before most of us were working, let's get the information out there. Let's talk about why they're influential and raise the level of their profile. Exactly.
Another fun thing about it, it was very fascinating to watch it and very humbling to watch it, is some of these people who got into the Fantasy Sports Writers Hall of Fame and were at the trade association, doing their speech, they brought their parents. They flew their parents in. And I mean, I get goosebumps. I'm like, my God, their parents are here. I mean, this is obviously, sometimes we're focused on, we got this Writers Association. It's a charitable thing we're working on. It's something I do part-time, and you just do it. You care about it. You're working hard at it. You want to make sure people have the opportunities to be considered. But then when you see these guys with their parents there who flew all the way in from wherever they lived, that was just really a special moment to see how important it was for these writers to be considered and win Hall of Fame.
Absolutely. And it's never about our group, but when you see that, you feel great because you know how much it is about them. Greg Kellogg was one of our inaugurals, and it was important, for Greg to bring, I think he brought his wife out with him, but, these are people that have never probably come to an FSTA event. They probably don't even know if they believe their husband or significant other that these things really go on. And so, they get exposure to the weird bunch of people in that room. But what a great moment for them to be recognized for legacy. It's one thing to say you're the football writer of the year. That's always been the most coveted prize. Or if you're a baseball guy, it's baseball. That's a huge deal. And you own that for a year. But to be in the Hall of Fame, we really invested heavily in finding nice plaques and those things because we wanted those people to feel special. And it was great that, for most of them, it was that type of experience.
Yeah, Katrina nailed a few of those plaques, but we ended up with some pretty cheap ones, but they were still important after that time. Tell us how you brought in Sirius Radio into the presentations.
Some of that was ideas through them. We had talked, and so they wanted to be able to, at that time it was finalists and Matt's last name escapes me.
Matt Deutsch.
And so he really was a visionary in fantasy and things like this, did a fantastic job. And so our ability to announce who the finalists are. That's the great thing about the writing awards is it used to be, okay, you're in there. Did you win or did you not win? Now it's like the Oscars. Are you among the nominees? I thought that was great, and Sirius really helped us to elevate that. Certainly I would say that when I felt, no matter what you do, at some point, I think you decide, hey, it's time for me to step out. Let's get some new energy in there. I knew that was coming for me, just where I was at in life. And so Andy Behrens was somebody I always had a lot of respect for, and asked Andy, hey, I'm thinking about stepping away. Would you step in? And so Andy, through that relationship with Sirius, he's really been able to take it to another level. Hall of Fame, you get some time on air. Those guys kind of get some interview time. And that media partnership has been a great thing for not just for the Writers Association, but I think for the whole industry. And so that was something I was certainly appreciative of, in addition to the FSTA at that time giving us some time on their agenda. Sirius really investing in and seeing the value and interest in the awards.
Yeah, and when we were at the trade association, they were out also, putting it on their radio show live, so that we got to hear all what these people had to say when they actually won their Hall of Fame honors. And then, of course, once we finally, the trade association said they didn't have the time to do that with us, being more a part of the Sirius radio was actually, like you said, a great thing that we were able to step to that and get the exposure to these writers that they deserve. So that was really exciting. Now let me say, I want to remind you, you wrote 3 books. Tell us about these books.
No, I had an opportunity. There's a publishing house in Illinois, and they had reached out to me for some Big Ten work I had done. And they did a book, a series of books, and wanted me to do one on Ohio State football. And so it was a collection of stories, not really a heavy book in terms of like chapters, but, more of a coffee table book. Thick book, took me better part of a year.
Wow.
But as a Badger fan, I have an appreciation for Ohio State football. I am a huge Woody Hayes guy, Chick Harley guy. When Woody turned 100, obviously he had passed. He passed in 87, I believe. But when he had his 100th birthday, I wrote an article for Yahoo about Woody Hayes that actually, this is one of the great thrills of my career, is that the athletic department at Ohio State took that article and they put it at the place setting of this dinner that they had for Woody Hayes.
Oh my, you gotta be kidding me.
No, and so I became a big Ohio State Woody Hayes guy through that project, and from that one I had a book contract to write. There was a series. Well, it used to be Sports Publishing LLC did a series of books for former athletes, and so I did one on the Badgers that I sold to another publisher, where they talk about kind of like their most memorable game from their time. And so 20 guys through that. And then I did a Complete Idiot's Guide for football. I think was the last thing I did at that point.
Complete, not just an idiot's guide, but a complete idiot's
guide. It has to be written by idiots to be an idiot's guide, though. So that's what I'm told.
That's what I for some reason either forgot or didn't know you wrote those books. That's quite cool stuff. I remember you did an article about the origins of fantasy football in the Cheat Sheets magazine. I forget, and you interviewed Ron Wolf, was it? And tell us about that experience. And did he remember a lot from the original days?
Your work in identifying Bill Winkenbach. And so in the Raiders organization, I've interviewed Ron Wolf for a number of stories. I mean, not just because he's a former Packers guy, but he's a great source. It's to the point now where I don't call Ron Wolf because I feel like I've relied on him too much. But the best thing about Ron Wolf is he's candid. I interviewed him once. I did a story, I think, for Football Digest on punters. And so the Packers, one of the big differences in the mid-'90s, because they beat New England, then they lost to Denver. A big difference was they lost Craig Hentrick, who was a great punter. And I asked Ron Wolf about that and letting Hendrick go on the market because I think he signed with Tennessee for like $1 million, which was a lot for a punter. And Ron Wolf said, that's not me. He's like, I told the negotiator to sign him and he dropped the ball, which I appreciate because it wasn't him passing the buck. It was him getting it right. I mean, if he was wrong, he'd tell you he was wrong, but he gets it right. He's not one of those guys that kind of just sugarcoats the story. And so he's very candid. And in some call, he just mentioned something about fantasy football with the Raiders. And so I put that in the back of my memory. And so we were talking at some point, you had done the story with Wingenbach and the Raiders, and knowing Ron Wolf was really Al Davis's chief scout. Al Davis found Ron Wolf because Ron wrote for, I think, what became Pro Football Weekly. And so he studied, in that time, he studied players. And so Davis wanted his kind of memory of stuff. And Ron Wolf became one of the early, along with Gil Brandt, one of the early great personnel guys, talent evaluator guys. And so he had said this. And so I called him up and said, tell me about that. And so it wasn't that Wolf was playing. It's that these guys, these minority owners and the Raiders would take him out for dinner and say, tell me about this guy. What do you know about this guy? And it was for the sake of fantasy football. And he thought it was just, kind of goofy, but he was getting free dinners out of it. So, it's amazing. Something back in the 60s has this connection, and Ron Wolf is in the Hall of Fame now and all these things. But back when he was a kid, he's got that linkage to our industry too.
I thought he was a co-manager one of the early years, if not the first year.
I think from what I recall, and I haven't come back to that story, but he may have had him help run his roster. I don't know if that was Winkenbach or somebody else, but it's funny because they're picking Blanda and they're all these other guys, but having your Chiefs, I'm sure Al Davis would have appreciated that. All his extra time is going to help this guy figure out who to put on his team and who to put in the lineup.
Yeah, Bob Harris, and I helped Bob with that article back in 2003, and it was a fun article. There's been articles before, but we really wanted to really put a great one together, and I went out. Well, first off, I called Andy Musolimas, who was in the original draft of '63, and I called him on the phone. I said, hey, I want to come out and visit you. Bob Harris is writing this article. I'm kind of just helping with pulling the data together. And I said, dig through your stuff. See if you can find any old papers, anything. And he calls me the next day. He goes, hey, Emil. I said, yeah. You sitting down? I said, yeah. He says, guess what I found? I said, the original fantasy football draft? He goes, yeah. I got gifts. I couldn't believe it. I mean, how lucky and fortunate that this guy kept the original fantasy draft, which of course we put in the article, and it's been around now. People copied it and whatnot, but that's great history. That's great history to have.
It is. I mean, 1991's not the same as the 60s, but I mean, I still somewhere have, stuff from that first fantasy league I was in. Mark DeYoung is a good friend of mine, but we would send it back and forth depending on who was commissioner, and used to do a newsletter. The stuff you keep, especially to have that kind of mind that the fantasy football player has, that stuff is sentimental. You keep that stuff. So on the one hand, it's fortunate for the rest of us that he kept it. On the other hand, you go, that's just the way people like us are built. Of course you're going to keep it because for whatever reason it meant that much then, and it's easy to stick it in a box someplace.
Yeah, sad one. When I was doing the investigation, Wingenbach started a league in 59, 60, 61, the Superior Tile Summer Invitational Home Run Tournament. It was the first baseball league. And I started fishing around, and I found one of the guys who was in it, who was very old at the time. And he just moved to Chandler, Arizona. And I got a hold of him in Chandler, Arizona. And I said, hey, you have any old stuff from that Superior Tile League? And he goes, well, if you'd have got a hold of me last year, I had it all, but I threw it all away and moved to Chandler. And it still annoys me that if we could have gotten that stuff, it would have been just a great treasure and it's a treasure to everybody because these are the fathers or the parents of this whole industry or of fantasy sports, and so everybody should appreciate and enjoy as much information as we can find. As a matter of fact, ironically, I had the newspaper.com subscription, which is not cheap. And I don't have it right now. And I tinkered around and I was looking through searching, and I found articles in the 60s by some of the people that were in the Goppel or that were in the Superior Tile, and they talked about those leagues in the mid 60s, which I thought was interesting because we have sports writers writing about fantasy sports in the mid 60s.
Well, and think about it. This is, obviously you've been doing this longer than I have. There was a time I could say much longer. I don't know that I can now, but you got 10 years on me in the industry. When I was starting in the early 2000s, I was doing a fair amount of radio back then, but there were people that wouldn't touch fantasy in the early to mid 2000s. Now that's not legitimate. We don't go fantasy. Fantasy's for losers. They didn't accept it. And until really the mainstream media and some of the coverage started putting it in there, I hate to say that they legitimized it, because the groundwork was everybody else. It was people like yourself and Bob that really helped to legitimize it. But it took a long time before the mainstream said, you know what? Okay, fine, fantasy fits. It's not just a bunch of kooks with newspapers. This is our fan base, and this is something more that they want out of us for coverage.
Yeah.
So
now there's a lot of companies, and obviously in the 80s, et cetera, building this product, and technology help with the internet, but the writers, I used to enjoy, there was a couple of guys on the radio, national sports talk guys, who hated fantasy, hated it. And I kind of figured out why after listening to them a while. They didn't know the details. So a guy would call and say, who's the number 2, number 3 receiver on the Rams? They didn't know. So they couldn't say, I don't know. They'd say, that's a stupid question, and they'd hang up on them. They just don't know the detail. These fantasy people want more detail, which, of course, eventually was fantastic, because as the talk shows, et cetera, started to think, well, wait a minute, we got additional content here. If we just learn that stuff, we got more people listening to us because we can provide that. But initially, they were just annoyed because they couldn't answer the questions.
No, I mean, there were so many opportunities missed, and at the same time, it was a more educated audience. I mean, I remember there was a time where things really, after you had the DirecTV package, which was big because that really catered to fantasy, the fear was, people are going to care more about, if Priest Holmes scores a touchdown than they do about their Packers winning the game. I don't think that's ever proven true. I'm no less of a Packers or a Cowboys fan today, but I am an NFL fan. It has helped give me an appreciation for other teams, both through fantasy and aside from fantasy, that I may not have had without it. So it's been great for the league. It's been great for sports media. And I think it was nice when it felt more like, hey, this is our own little thing, and kind of a clubhouse mentality. It's grown way beyond that. The secret's gotten out, but it's been good for everyone.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think it's kind of funny. It's too bad we can't actually measure how much fantasy had helped the NFL back in the mid-90s and the early 2000s. Because, during that process, the NFL either was extremely annoyed by fantasy because people would call the PR department and ask if Joe Smith was going to play this week because of his ankle injury. And secondly, they were extremely worried it was considered gambling. So they just hated fantasy. I mean, it drove them nuts. And then once they finally decided they kind of liked fantasy, they tried to take it over. Yeah. And luckily they failed at that. But, I think they finally went, wait a minute. I mean, we're really getting a lot of traffic by these fantasy people. Our growth is important. So then now they've embraced it, and on their TV shows, the NFL network, a lot of it is fantasy. If it's not obvious, it's subtle. And so they've now completely recognized, over the last decade or so of, yeah, this is a really important part of people watching our sport.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. I've had the opportunity to interview a lot of people, talk to a lot of people, and people will say, you know Michael Fabiano? It's like, yeah. Or you've met Matt Berry? It's crazy because there was no acceptance, and now the people in our industry that are high profile, they're celebrities themselves. And then you have mainstream or former players that are they're part of the fantasy arm for the NFL or for ESPN or other groups. That shift from where it was 15, 20 years ago, where you were shut out, and now some of the biggest personalities on your network are your fantasy people. It's crazy, but it is a great thing. And I do credit people like yourself and Bob and Ron Chandler and people that were early 80s people. Without that, we don't get to this point. We had to have the true early pioneers. And the rest of us all kind of came in and did our piece. And then, you get to a point where you have widespread acceptance and appreciation.
Yeah, a lot of people in the late 80s. You've got the Grogan started a magazine in 86. Krause,
good guy.
Greg Ambrosius started one somewhere in that time frame. I haven't talked to him yet to get the exact date. The Index started in 87. I started in 90. I'm probably going to forget somebody. They had the newspaper games start, the salary cap contest. There's a handful of them. If you watch Jeff Thomas's interview, he's got all the details, which I can't remember, and he started early 90s in that. So there's a ton of people that were involved. And Cliff Charpentier, I think was 85 or so. He had his book and he started a magazine somewhere in that time frame. So yeah, a lot was going on in the 80s, ironically, that to help this slow evolution. And a lot of people thought it's a fluke and whatnot, but despite no modern technology, all those decades, finally getting into the mid 90s and late 90s when the internet showed up, and then there became, NFL got more and more popular too, but the technology helped, and then finally media and the NFL said, oh, wait a minute, we need to embrace this. And of course that definitely helped because they talked about it and became more popular.
I think it helped too, the changes in the game. Most of that is rooted in kind of the 78 rule changes, which slowly evolved. But I think the NFL being a little bit more high speed, there are more yards. There's more points. I think that probably caters to fantasy. That's probably given it a boost. I don't know if the fantasy had launched in the 70s where you had defenses and run control more widespread, I don't know if it would have been the same path. But, you recall kind of the real takeoff of fantasy was Marshall Faulk and the Rams years. And that's where you hit new ground. I think that's where the FSTA would say they had a lot of new businesses, kind of that late 90s into mid 2000s range. And there was a lot of excitement and a lot of, big stars that were also big fantasy stars through that period. You didn't have Marshall Faulk, you didn't have the first pick, you weren't going to win. There's been years more recently where you don't want the first pick because there's nobody clear cut. You'd rather be sitting 6th or 8th. But back then, the Faulk, Priest, Holmes, that period, the feeling was if you didn't get that guy, holy cow, you're in trouble because whoever does has a huge advantage.
Yeah, they were definitely stud running backs back then, and it's changed a lot. I think another interesting to add to your point about the offense, pardon me, is the incomplete pass. My opinion, and you can argue with me, is they created this bizarre new incomplete pass scenario because they didn't want fumbles. They want the offense to score. So they created this rule where you had to catch the ball and, dance in the circle and, wave your hand up in the air. I'm joking. Before, if you got hit out of your hand, it wasn't a fumble, which has annoyed a lot of people. But I think the reason they did it is because they didn't want fumbles. They want offenses to score. What do you think about that theory?
Well, there's no question that all of the rule changes have favored the offense. So that is one more of them. I don't like the catch rule. It's made it cloudier than it ever was before. To me, it was crystal clear a decade ago. Des Bryant, that's a catch. That's a tough game for me because I don't get to pick sides. It's like Sophie's Choice, but that's a catch. But that was a mistake. I get it. Protecting quarterbacks was never about quarterbacks. We don't put that much energy into punters, and they're much more vulnerable in their position than a quarterback is. That's really about protecting dollars and cents for owners, and protecting somebody that a lot of times is your guy for 10 or 12 years, more than being sold on safety or those things. And it definitely leads to more points and more people in the seats. I think the NFL makes a lot of decisions based on dollars and cents and packages those decisions in other ways. But
the other problem is developing quarterbacks. I mean, the step down from starting quarterback to backup is hellacious, and it completely ruins your team if that guy's out for any time of period. And you're not going to sell as many tickets. You're going to lose money, and you can't just find another quarterback in a year. And so I can understand why they wanted to protect the quarterback, because it would just completely change everything about things. And so yeah, it's you kind of go, oh, you're protecting the quarterback, but yeah, maybe you would too if you were in their position. And
I mean, even defense, if you look at 20 years ago, 30 years ago, what we celebrated to now what we call cheap and dirty. I mean, Jack Tatum, but up through Ronnie Lott, Steve Atwater, those guys were celebrated for hard, vicious hits, and that was part of the game. And now you can't control your body launching at a trajectory without being potentially committing a game-changing penalty, which totally changes it. I would hate to be a defensive back in this era because it's really difficult to make plays.
Yeah.
So it's tough. I mean, I do know football is vulnerable in the sense of safety and what parents think, and I coached football at the high school level for several years, and I get it. At the same time, it's just weird to be our age or our age group and to have watched a game and then to try to communicate that to a group that's never watched that game.
Yeah, that's true. That's a complete evolution. So you have any other stories or things you'd like to bring up?
No, it's just, being part of fantasy for 20 years, it is a weird group of guys. I mean, we've both went to a number of conferences. You meet people. It is nice that, Matt Berry and Michael Fabiano are just average guys like most of us. They've become bigger celebrity and those things, but, it is a room where everybody comes from the same. There's certainly ego in our industry like anything else, but the want of people to give back and to help people, break into the industry because we've all come from it, that always made it worthwhile. When it was my turn to kind of step away from it, I felt really good about that time and the people I worked with. And certainly, Emil, I've always been grateful for our work relationship and the opportunity I had to write for you and some of the other work we've done. But I've had a chance to really work with a number of really great people. So I'm grateful for that.
Well, you've had a great career, and you're truly a pioneer of fantasy sports. And, the Writers Association, we talked a lot about it. It's something that a lot of people don't even know about, fans and whatnot. And you did some great work, and those are the behind-the-scenes things that people don't see, and yet they're, helping the community and helping people. And I think you should really be proud of that, the work that you did there also.
Well, thank you. And I am really grateful. I mean, you're still involved. Bob Harris is still involved, and Andy Behrens has taken that on and put his time into it. Andy's a fantastic guy. We both have daughters that are cross-country daughters, and so it's been fun to relate with Andy in something that goes beyond football and fantasy football. But it was something I was a part of for a decade and really saw it as a privilege for me, not anything more than that.
Well, congratulations for being a pioneer of fantasy sports, and thanks for the time also.
Thank you, Emil.